Question. Do you believe that liberty is adverse to human nature? If you look at the history of the world, people who fall under liberty, it's a small minority of people that ever try to be free. It's not that it's not human nature to want to be free, but it appears like we fall under the spell of wanting to be controlled. Because if we look through the history of the world, most cases people have been under control.
I don't think that they do. I think people want to control. I think the people in our flesh, our ego, have this real control freak nature. And it's based upon fear. At a very elementary level, we are motivated by two opposing forces. One is love and one is fear. And they're always in conflict with each other. And the fear-based motivation that we have within us, the first line of attack is to control what we're afraid of. And as long as we can control it, we think we can be secure. And so that then translates out into wanting to control others, and then eventually it blossoms into a tree of control, and now we're all just subject to control because it's the nature of our egotistical nature.
Pause if you would for a second. Let's take a call.
Oh, wonderful.
Welcome to the Trading Post. You're live on the air.
Good morning. The thing that I wanted to discuss with David Justice is it does say that in the Bible, but it does not mean that when a government does not obey God's laws. I think the Bible shows us that when someone does something against God's laws, that then you obey God and not man. And I believe the Apostle Peter brought that out. And the governments today, like he said, are far removed from God. And they're, on a worldwide scale, are run the dictatorship. That's what we see. So I'll just listen to your comment.
All right, Carolyn, thanks for calling.
Carolyn, you know, the love of money, as you said, is the root of all evil, and some versions would say, and some people would argue that it's the root of all kinds of evil. But nevertheless, the love of money, which translates into greed, which translates into avarice, is a very motivating factor because it has its roots in fear. And again, this goes to control. People that desire to be wealthy in this life have set before themselves the need to control so that they can have wealth, and in that wealth find security. And this has translated out into our population. Our public school system now raises up people to plug into society in whatever role they feel that they can plug into in the machine. The need to make money has become America's #1 need. The need to fit in is the need to have a position or to have status, and making money and wealth has become the motivating factor in our education system. Love of God and love of neighbor is not taught in school. These are not religious philosophies. These are philosophies. These are truths. And if we can't operate in these truths, and we're more interested in one-upping our neighbor or having a position or having more money, and if this is our entire focus, then we've lost sight of simple reality, which is learning how to live in a society with each other as co-sovereigns within a sovereign body politic. So, getting back to Carolyn, the nations of the world, the governments of the world have become empires, and now we're moving toward a global empire under the United Nations. America can't help it but give up her sovereignty every time we operate under an international treaty or whatever we've done to put ourselves in a situation where we feel obligated to be the world's policeman. We have moved away from what the Founding Fathers intended, which was a government which is merely there to secure to us the unalienable rights endowed upon us by the Creator. It was never intended for this government to become an empire. And the Founding Fathers said, when a long train of abuses and usurpations, pursuing invariably the same object, evinces a design to reduce the people under absolute despotism, which the opposite would be to elevate the government to an absolute empire, that the people have a duty to throw that government off. Now, if the people have a duty to throw a government off, the last conversation that this government would want us to have is, what does that look like? And if we were to do that, what kind of government would we establish if we did throw this one off? That kind of conversation is the kind of conversations that sovereigns should be having. That's the kind of conversation that kings should be having. And that's the kind of conversation that Americans are not having. We're afraid to have that conversation. But the simple fact that we in this country are in that capacity as sovereign, and that the government is in the capacity of agent, obligates us to have that conversation that we're having right now.
But when you're talking about throwing the government off, you're talking about throwing it off to the basis and the roots that it began with.
Yes, that's exactly what. Thomas Jefferson laid the foundation of this country. You could call it the birth certificate of America. The Declaration of Independence is the birth certificate of America. It establishes the principles and the philosophy upon which America is established. Now, I, for one, particularly like the Constitution. I think it's a great document, and I think we should use it. Now, it could be tweaked in a couple of ways, but for the most part, it's a good document. But this government is no longer operating under the Constitution. Plain and simple. The governments have operated under the principles of contract law, admiralty jurisdiction, contract, economics, and those are the principles that the government is now operating under. So the government has actually thrown off its charter by moving into a system of governance that is contrary to the Constitution. It was Abraham Lincoln who said he didn't advocate overthrowing the government, he advocated overthrowing the men who were overthrowing the Constitution. So I'm in the position where I believe the Constitution is a good document, and we need to study it and understand the principles of what it established for each state and for the federal government. And only by understanding these fundamental principles, knowledge, can we begin to distinguish how far off base this government has actually come.
You talk about having those conversations. In your mind, what are those conversations like?
Okay, let's talk about this. Jesus, let's go back to the gospel of Christ. That this nation is founded on the gospel of Christ. What does that mean? Going to church on Sunday? What does going to church on Sunday have to do with a nation being established? Jesus spoke of the kingdom of heaven on earth as it is in heaven. When he says, when you pray, pray our Father who art in heaven, hallowed be your name. May your kingdom come and your will be done. The kingdom of heaven is the gospel of Christ. The fact that Christ is the firstborn among many brethren. The fact that Christ walked a life and demonstrated the power that each one of us has if we would just accept it and come into relationship. Jesus was establishing that each one of us in this context as a child of God has the capacity to rule and reign with Christ in his throne in this kingdom of heaven. This is not a religious mythology. This is not a religious dogma. This is a truth that Christ spoke of. When I talk about government, Christ was the one that first talked about liberty, and he told his apostles specifically not to lord over each other or lord over people like all of the governments of the world do. And this is what governments of the world do. It's a top-down hierarchical type of authority, whereas under the gospel, the hierarchy was a lowerarchy, where the ones in positions of leadership were there to serve, not to lord over. So this concept of bottom-up service rather than top-down tyranny, that was a fundamental principle of the gospel, and this is the fundamental principle of the Constitution. If we can't understand that first principle, it's difficult for us to understand how the people could be sovereign and the government are served.